Please welcome Mike Hanley.
All right, well, thanks everybody, and welcome back to this afternoon's session where we will be talking about unlocking accelerated innovation without compromising trust, which maybe if you shorten that, do security better for people so they have a good experience, maybe is another way of saying that. So I'm joined by a wonderful panel, and again, I'm Mike Hanley, I run security and engineering here at GitHub, and I'm going to ask our panelists to just briefly introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about maybe some of the top priorities in your organization for the year ahead. So Vince, we'll start with you.
So my name's Vince King. I'm a reformed developer. I now focus on cybersecurity and cloud transformation for the Bank of England. I've been there for over a decade now. One of the main priorities, and this is, I've got a bone to pick with you. You've annoyed me.
That's why we're here, so we can do it in public.
You've annoyed me twice, once yesterday and once today, by using a trigger phrase. You talked about shifting left.
Yes, we can get into that.
Now, I just want to say, I have strong opinions. It's not shift left because it means that cyber are delegating the accountability to developers, and then developers are overwhelmed as it is. I know there's going to be tooling to help them, but I think it was Jared came up with a phrase, shift everywhere. So I just wanted to pull that out. Thanks.
I love it. We'll figure out how to graphically represent
I just feel...
If 3 new security catchphrases come out of this panel, we'll have done our job.
Marketing.
Thanks, Vince. Jerry?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jerry McMahon. I work for Fidelity Investments, where I lead our ALM tools and platforms. So everything from how developers get code, write code, and how developers ship code into production. So from a security perspective, I like the phrase security inbuilt, right? Security is built in, so how do we just build security into the platform? And so developers can focus on what they need to do, and really the platform is where the shift is. So that's our focus. Our priority this year is just to democratize security, make it available to everybody, and have codified excellence in the platform.
Awesome. Thanks for being with us today. Siggy?
Yeah, my name is Sigurd Pollmann. I'm working for Deutsche Börse Group, the German stock exchange. Responsible for the DevSecOps toolchain, the group-wide. That's why I would say security is really a major topic today. I think the main topic what I have, besides shifting left or shifting everywhere, it's really being ready for the unexpected in the security world. So it's especially with the cyber attacks and everything, being a critical infrastructure, it's really of utmost importance to be really being ready for everything what's happening. I think that's the most interesting thing that's happening today.
Yeah, absolutely. And Helen?
Hi, everyone. My name's Helen Lau. I'm an engineer. I work for a bank in Australia, Commonwealth Bank of Australia. I look after engineering tooling across the bank. So the biggest sort of challenge or priority for me is always trying to embrace innovation, enable that happen for engineers across the bank. At the same time, keep our bank safe and secure. So we are, no one wants to, have your bank account, your money stolen or anything like that happening. So that will be not a good customer experience to our customers across Australia. We want to keep the financial system safe and secure. At the same time, we want to allow our engineers to innovate, to test and learn, to try new things, anything that we think of. So security, innovation, taking the right balance is always my number 1 priority.
Well, that's a good tee up maybe to my first big question for the panel. So Helen, maybe we'll start with you and we'll kind of work our way back this way. But what is good security? And I think it's a challenge because obviously the space has matured over time, but I think there are a lot of different philosophies, and it really depends on the vertical that you're in, what kind of regulation you need to think about, what standards you comply with, who your customers are, what their needs are. So maybe the 4 of you, could you just say a few brief words about what is good security to your organization? What are some of the properties or some of the things that you look for when you think about a good security outcome?
Cool. I'll start with, I look after the engineering tooling, so what I call it build time. So the moment of our developer cutting the code on their machine, all the way made it the code and the feature into production. That's my responsibility, and hope to secure the bank. On top of that, I don't run the cyber team, so we have a full cyber team basically look at the parameters, make sure everything that we publish, the mobile app, website, any of the servers available are safe and secure at the same time. So I'm not going to touch on the runtime, so that's probably not my expertise. I will invite our CISO come on the stage to explain that, but I cover engineering. So on the engineering, what we're really looking at is shift left, but to Jared's point, shift everywhere, yes.
I don't think we're going to be able to get off the stage until we find a term that works for Vince.
Yes, at the moment of when the user's actually cutting the code on the laptop, they check into the source code repository. So we recently adopted advanced security, so really what keeps me up at night is secrets made it to the source code.
Yeah.
And that made it to production. So those are the stuff that I really look at and ensure our engineers across the bank that no one does anything silly. If they do, we caught it by the tool and automation and prompt them to fix it at the moment rather than too late. So.
Awesome. And Siggy, how about you? What's good security look like from a properties or principles standpoint?
I think it's, as I said, from the DevSecOps tool chain, like bringing the tools then to developers and for the security experts to be ready then for all the attacks or for like not introducing vulnerable code then into the production. But to be honest, it's like it's always a little battle in between. So it's one side, as we said, getting the developer happy, getting the security people happy is a little bit difficult then in the times. But that's why, as you said, with GitHub Advanced Security, we really had a very good chance then to introduce. And to be honest, it was secret scanning as well, who was like the one who triggered it to really then have this stopping to leak then outside, because then you're having then one repo, maybe then getting as an intrusion vector, and then you will be open for everything. So it's really hard then to catch this up. I think that's the security is really like enable then the developers and enable the security guys working together on one platform.
Yeah, I mean certainly like one thing I feel like I hear in both your responses is everybody's got different priorities that we need to work through. So it's finding those shared wins and opportunities where, what's right for the company and how do we get the security and engineering teams to go there together. Yeah. And it's also interesting to me that one thing that stands out about both your answers is really thinking through, well, these are kind of foundational things, right? Like let's get the basics right first before we sort of move up the stack to some of the more sophisticated stuff. So it's great to hear that's been a focal point for you guys. And how about you, Jer?
Yeah, so we'll go into our security everywhere. I think it was like we've shift left, shift middle, and shift right. So I think it's, for security, for us, it's about how do we introduce security at the right time and within the SDLC flow. So if a developer is coding, how do we have security when they're coding? When we're building, how would you have security there and then? So if a malicious package, like seconds, and you can be in trouble, right? Yeah. So when we do download, how do we download open source from the public internet, from these repositories? Even though organizations do fantastic work in trying to ensure the safety of all of the code we depend upon, but ensuring we have practices at the developer flow that we block, and again at the build time. So if you bring in dependencies at the build time, that we're checking them at source. And then it's like, so we've got the code we depend upon, we've got the code we write, so how are we scanning that? So things like either whether you got Dependabot or something like GAS, scanning that all the time, and then the secrets we keep, right? So ensure nothing gets into the code and then something bad can happen once it's there. So I think just protecting it at the right time at the flow, providing that feedback instantaneously that, this, whatever, either thing we brought in or thing we created has a vulnerability or an exposure that we could be at risk with, and then removing that at source before it gets everywhere near the code. So I think that's where we focus on.
Yeah. Yeah, and then Vince, as a self-described reformed developer, I'd love to hear your thoughts too. And maybe after that, in addition to your take on it, another challenge here clearly is how do you then measure, like how do you know that you've got good, right? Like we can describe it in sort of qualitative terms, but what are some of the things that, to build on your answer, how do you think about actually measuring those outputs and relaying them to people who can't describe what it means to be in the flow? I would love to just get your take on that too.
So for us, a big priority is resilience. We're seeing more and more attacks coming much quicker than before. One thing that we recognized over COVID was if an exposure or zero came out, the remediation time wasn't coming down, but the threat was being activated a lot quicker. So the resilience that we're putting in place are the usual people, process, and technology. Starting with the people, you know, the developers that are making sure that it's not just the training and awareness, but it's their behaviors and the culture. And one of the phrases I love is, culture is what happens when no one's looking. And if you get that culture right, then they're going to be bought into a security-focused development environment. So if you're sitting beside someone and someone's going, I'm just going to put this in to GitHub as a test, hopefully the certain person sitting next to them slaps them and go, no, you can't do that. And it's when you reach that level of maturity in the culture, I think that's a huge step forward.
Yeah.
For metrics, they're a poison chalice sometimes. I worked a lot on kind of designing a cyber dashboard to communicate, to create a language where cyber could communicate with the business and with technology. Because when, as a cyber professional, you go out and you talk about CVEs and exploits and some of the risks, likelihood, impact, and you're using some language that stakeholders and even tech people aren't used to. So we created some dashboards to have that as a common touch point, a single pane of glass. And similarly, for any development, whether it's number of commits, number of scans that you're doing, CodeQL results for the code scanning, secrets, anything like that. But it has to be tracked, because any metric is only good for the few seconds that it takes to generate. In a couple of minutes, you're having millions of commits a day. Something could have been put in that short period of time. So it's not the figure or the value or the color of the pretty little box. It's trending.
Yeah, managing that drift over time from some expectation of what good looks like.
And especially when you're trying to communicate that to executives. They're very busy people. They see dozens of presentations a day potentially, and they may only remember red, amber, or green.
Yeah.
And a chart that either goes down or up.
Yeah, we do love our charts and spark lines in the security business, don't we? I was thinking about what you said about culture, and many of you probably heard the famous quote from Peter Drucker, where he said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think if he had had a CISO in the 70s, I don't think the role was around yet, but if he had had a CISO in the 70s, his CISO would have said, security culture eats security strategy for breakfast. I'd like to think that was the case.
I do see when I talk to people that they do a lot of the awareness and education, a lot of the training, people going on courses, it's a week away from work and things like that, but when they come back, all that new learning can sometimes be diluted because the culture isn't there to support them. So getting that right is hugely important.
Yeah. Any other thoughts from the rest of our panelists just on metrics and how do you go from, I like these principles, this is my vision for what good looks like, but how do you put it into the quad chart or a PowerPoint slide?
Well, I get that question a lot from management, believe it or not, as in how productive is our engineers? Or how much can we ship faster to features to our customer? Can you measure A, B, C, D? So these sort of questions that we get asked from basically the C-level or technology leadership team a lot. The way I see it is actually not how fast or how many commit we do a day. It's actually how much business value we deliver, how many problem we solve for our customer. I start to shift that sort of conversation in that sort of direction. We do have metrics internally we track, basically from your first commit of the code to that actually made it all the way through from your dev test staging all the way to production, because production's where our customer or actual end user use that feature. So those sort of timing we're trying to track, and how I see the benefit of moving us from on-prem GitHub to cloud is the automation piece of GitHub Actions. So believe it or not, we'd have quite a few CI/CD tooling available, already existing across the bank over many years. For any organization been around probably like us over 100 years, you will inherit a lot of applications, different stacks that you have to support. So for us to modernize, standardize, the thing is I can't standardize everything. What I wanted to do is I want to automate, but first thing I want to stream down number of tools then I can measure using the tool and the metrics available, which I raised the question, can I get these stats? And I'm really hungry on these like logs and stuff like that to measure. So at the moment, we're tracking our engineers from the commit to production, also lead time to restore or I think incident happen. So those are the key things how we see is availability, resilience of our services to our customers, because those are the stuff that actually have a customer impact. So those are the ones who cause us with a low NPS score. These are the stuff that should be front of mind. Doesn't matter you're in tech or you're in business, because we are working in the bank across serving the entire country, in Australia. And that's the stuff that we want to measure. And probably not say how many commit you do a day or how many lines of code you've written. Probably will drive a wrong type of behavior. Yeah. We know engineers are really smart. As soon as you have a metrics that attach to their bonus, they can gamify it and they can get the biggest bonus.
Yeah, I'm sure nobody's ever gamed the system, right? Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's a good point. The metrics can send signals about what you value, and you need to make sure that that doesn't undermine the rest of your approach. So it's not so much, well, I'm filling out the quad chart on the slide. It's also just thinking about what the underlying meanings and incentives are behind those as well. So no, I think and certainly if the metric said we always want 0 incidents, you probably have 0 velocity as well. And maybe that's a segue here to the next question. And Siggy, I'll start with you. We've talked a little bit just in some of our green room conversations and a little bit this morning about security and velocity, and can you have your cake and eat it too? And I'd love to just hear a little bit more about, like, how do you think about that balance and communicating that balance to your employees so that they can keep that? Because it's a difficult thing to I think, articulate and get people to adhere to.
Yeah, it can be a difficult thing. It really depends. I think if as you said, the culture. It's at the end. It's really like it's not like sometimes it's about the tooling. As you said, there's always an inherited, I would say, amount of different tools which try to connect. And as we heard today in the keynote as well, getting out of the flow and means like slower. Being ready, being disrupted, and so on. It's one thing is about the tooling. The other one is like the willingness to say, okay, I want to do secure code. I think that often the problem is that a lot of this security policies, they are buried in paper.
Yeah.
So you have no guardrails in the tools. It's like means that you read that manual, 20 pages there, 100 pages, this SDLC
and every
policies.
engineer reads those, right, and memorizes them front to back.
It's really
like,
to be honest, it's like a new guy or whatever, starting developing says, okay, just trying, and then making maybe then the defects in the code. So it's really like, it's about educating, guardrailing, and that the software setting then the scene. The tooling settings the scene. I think that's the only way where you can, it's like, coming from Germany, German Autobahn, it's like, it's very good conditions so you can drive without the limits, but it's like you have to invest into infrastructure. It's the same thing here. You have really then to invest in the infrastructure to give the developers and security guys then really then the tool what they need.
Yeah, and being from Southeast Michigan, I have more of the Detroit automotive analogies than what I'd get in Germany. But sometimes I'll often say to people, you actually have brakes on the car to go fast, and that some of these security constraints or some of the security controls or policies that we have actually allow us to go confidently at a faster rate of speed and take smarter risks. And Jared, what does that look like for you inside Fidelity?
So I think the big thing is So traditional security mechanisms, when you join data center, you could have small teams and they were able to protect the firm because they had 4 walls. When we know with digital transformation going to cloud, it's, how do you scale that security expertise across the organization? So we have this concept we call a platform that developers can use to get their production and get their value out to our customers is, if that's an invisible platform that just sits there working behind the scenes and keeping the developer's code safe. So that's what we try and do. But then I think the critical thing then is to bring visibility and transparency into what we're monitoring and what we're scanning of that code, security being one of the dimensions we would do, and then highlighting it, right? So making it available there in plain text or with what it is, what's the remediation, or how do I recover from it? Because developers are very proud people, right? We love our craft. We love to make beautiful products and beautiful services, and we want to have very, very happy customers. So I think if we make that available, people will naturally look to fix themselves. They won't want something going into production that's bad, right? And if that does happen, I think it's trying to understand, being empathetic to them, trying to understand, well, what was the situation that caused? Because we know you wouldn't do it in real life. So what was the situation that maybe, if you have visibility into it, what caused you to let that go, and understanding that and working with them. And I think and we usually, some people use metrics for, in a negative way, but you can actually turn them into a positive and say, okay, not look at who's bad, but look who's good. And what are they doing that makes them very, very good? Get the learnings from them, and then sharing that back to the rest of an organization as a way to help people get better and improve over time. So I think once you get that, and I think we touched on earlier, culture.
Yeah.
Right. So I think just building that culture, and I think developers then, they don't see security as a friction or as a blocker, right? They see them as a partner, as a way to
an enabler to help you go fast.
Go fast, exactly. Yeah.
And we've talked. I mean, each of us have said a few words about culture and how to think about some of this internally. But there's also external forces that I think is unique to this panel that I think our audience has an opportunity to hear from each of you on, which in the form of regulation. And we all have to deal with some amount of that in our jobs, and certainly the security space and risk management generally are places where we think about regulation. How does that fit in when you think about a strategy or good regulation, or how that intersects with your internal practices and policies? And Vince, maybe you could start us off because you've got kind of a unique position on this.
Yeah, so whether you have regulations hanging over your head at the moment or not, they are coming. And they are for good, and there's a lot of overhead and a lot of thinking to do about it. I'll let Siggy and Jer talk about DORA, which has been brought in, which is the Digital Operational Resilience Act that is now live in Europe, but comes into full effect, I think it's January next year. And some of the pillars of that, three of the pillars I quite impressed is around communication, especially in the financial industry. So if one bank or institution has a breach or a cyber attack, they are responsible for communicating that to the regulator, but also to their peers. And very often, and when I talk to CISOs, it's interesting sitting around a table, asking how many of them have suffered some kind of cyber attack. And you never hear about it because it's a badge of shame. But I was talking to Siggy earlier, if you were hiring a CISO, would you want to hire a CISO who has never had an attack, never lived that experience, or someone that has?
Absolutely the latter. Yeah.
Exactly. But we still haven't got that confidence to share our experiences, either across the industry or across our peers. And this regulation, part of that is the communication, and it's going to force us to be more open, which I think is going to be a great thing.
And it's addressing really a defect that I think has been in the security industry for some time, which is there's a lot of informal channels, right? Like where CISOs are sharing notes and teams share notes. But if you look at like the the Information Sharing and Analysis Council, like here in the United States, the ISACs, for example. Obviously, you have these smaller industry working groups, but it's not you're not compelled to participate necessarily or share. There's certainly a benefit there, but I think this is a place where regulation can help encourage opening those conversations up in a more timely fashion.
A rising tide raises all ships.
Yeah, indeed. Jerry, any thoughts on that, or how you're thinking through implementing or leading up to some of these timelines?
Yeah, I think it's we have a cybersecurity group, and they kind of end up managing, and we have regulations from the United States. We also have customers and contracts where you might have certain policies and controls. And again, I think it's all about, I don't think they're any different. It's like we got to allow teams, to Helen's point, innovate fast and get value out, but we also, how do you do that, make sure we're safe and control. And I think some of the way the open source, like, so if we take, say, Log4j, when it was back, it was the open source community that really came together to share, as you just said. It's like, how do we collaborate together? How do we share together? And how do we, because we're all subject to the same, threats and risks and compliance to regulation. So how do we share, and we work best together? And how do we, rather than every single organization in the world trying to deliver the same thing repeatedly? Is there a way we can, through standards, through communities, to build solutions that can satisfy these in easy ways to allow our developers work? But the more you can automate it in the background, and the more you, and again, just share information when you're deviating or getting away from that, I think that's the critical thing, so developers just know.
Yeah, and kind of building on the points from two of you, for Siggy and Helen, I'd love to hear, a little bit more about how you're also thinking about this in your space, but also there's been a lot of new news in the regulatory space, certainly in the last few weeks, and especially here in the United States, there have been a number of headlines in recent weeks about new disclosure requirements from the SEC, and where you're actually filing an 8K when you have a material security event to inform investors. Do you generally feel like this is taking us in the right direction as an industry from a transparency standpoint? And what else needs to be happening in terms of regulation to help get to a place where we're realizing good outcomes beyond some of the information sharing?
Yeah, to me?
Go ahead, Steve. Yep, go ahead. Then Helen will take your thoughts after that.
Yeah, it's the regulation. All industry have to face some regulation. So I think it's the same what you say with the culture. Regulation is there. Embrace the change, embrace that it's happened, and embrace the opportunity what you have. So you can always do it good or do it bad. At the end, it's like how you orchestrate it, like how you make it happen, and getting the different viewpoints. The regulators, they don't do it like to harm then the business. Maybe it's because of the impact that business are not ready, or maybe, whatever reason it is, it could be, but normally you can, I would say, you influence, you can make your standpoint there and then see that is happening in a better way. So it's always a collaboration. I see that the regulator is more like, it's an outside security team.
Yeah.
Sitting really like normal side of the scene, and you have then to get this happen on your level in the company, being part of critical infrastructure, being critical for the economy, so that is happening. So that's it's even more important to have this transparency in, and that's why you need to have your, let me say, homework done, that you can do this on an easy scale. So if not, then you have to invest quite a lot.
Exactly. Yeah, I think a big theme of what I'm hearing is often, like when I've talked to other CISOs, you talk about, working with internal audit. You both want the same thing. You want shareholder value. You want good security outcomes for the company. You want to avoid bad things happening. And I think to your point, a regulator is part of that picture, and you want to work with them because, again, at the end of the day, they want the same objective. They apply different forces on the problems, but making sure that we're communicating openly, transparently, moving in the right direction. I think that's a great insight. Helen, any other thoughts from you on this topic?
I definitely think we are heading towards the right direction. So first, when regulators come to us about security, what they're really trying to achieve, the goal is to keep the consumer data and their sort of financial well-being safe, in a safe environment. That's why we need to do it. So from an internal engineering team point of view, how do I uphold that? At the same time, give our engineers across the bank the freedom and flexibility to innovate and try new things. So a lot of things that internally what we're doing is we look at what are the control and compliance requirement that we need to satisfy. For example, we need to have a peer review. Can we automate that in our pipeline? Yes, we can. Can we do vulnerability scanning, code quality scanning? Can we automate that in our pipeline? Yes, we can. So that's how we're looking at in my team is in the next, or actually in this financial year, automate that for our engineers across the bank. So they don't have to think about setting up these maybe 6 or 7 steps that require from a regulatory point of view. We actually bake these in as our GitHub Actions mandatory steps. As long as you use it, you invoke, it actually does all that automatically for you. For me, the North Star is really our engineers finish cutting the code, they can hit a commit, pull request, approve. In minutes, that can go into production because it can do automated testing, vulnerability scanning, code quality, so on and so forth. It does all the checks for you without going through a manual approval and set up a meeting, get maybe 20 people to sign off or so on and so forth before you can actually push a button to release this feature into production. That's the way, as an engineer, how I tackle this problem, and that's what I wanted to do as my team to help the rest of the engineers to move and ship features faster.
Well, I'd be remiss in this panel if I didn't take some time to talk about artificial intelligence, which has been a big theme this week. So I would hate to leave that out. So I'd love to kind of switch off of regulation and move into that. Though I'll note that there's clearly a connection here. So obviously in the United States, about 2 weeks ago, the Biden administration sent out a new executive order describing some of the work that they're going to be doing around artificial intelligence and the role of regulation in that. And again, inviting, I think, in a collaborative way, commentary from the private sector. I think to your points about this being a team sport, which is great. But again, switching gears to talk a little more about AI, I'd love to hear what's the appetite for this in your organizations, what's working well and not, and how are you thinking about bringing that into your companies, knowing that there's probably a demand across the board. So Helen, maybe you can kick us off and talk a little bit about how AI looks in your organization.
Sure. When I say AI is a hype, probably understatement right now. Everyone's talking about it. Everyone's asking, can I get Copilot? Can I get this? Can I get that? That's definitely the hottest topic right now across tech. For us, across the bank, we actually want to try a lot of this stuff at the same time keeping the bank safe. So a lot of times we call it pilot and co-pilot, a small team of people, get them use it, adopt, and then we measure how it's the output. On top of that, we're actually doing a lot of Gen AI stuff for our customer in terms of like fraud, scan, and stuff like that, sort of vetting and keeping our customers' account and financial systems safe. And that should be always front of mind. And to your point about responsible AI, those are the stuff that as a technologist, we should be front of mind when we're actually dealing with PII, PCI data on a regular basis. So operating in a bank that cross, retail, business banking, a whole different sector, a lot of these stuff that we need to be conscious. So sometimes people are saying, why are you doing a small use case? Actually, no. Actually, we want to try all the stuff, but the thing is we need to take a pragmatic approach to saying what is the biggest problem, biggest bang for our buck. And these are the stuff that we need to test and learn. And once we've proven the value, then we do a scale rollout and adoption and so on and so forth. So that's the approach that, or at least my company and myself is doing. And we are trying a lot of the stuff, and not 10 things we tried, 10 things made it to production. That's something that everyone should be aware of. Maybe 10 things we try, 2 or 3 things made to production. But those 2 or 3 things, the yield is probably 10x, 20x of what we do today.
Yeah, and Siggy, when you're thinking about like DevSecOps in your organization, right, you've got to balance the speed and velocity piece again, try to find that optimum where you're achieving both. Clearly AI can be a part of that, but who else do you need to bring along to get AI done inside your organization?
Yeah, so it's, it was always a joke in the beginning. In the beginning we said, especially Copilot. Copilot was not used by the developers. Copilot was used by the legal and the compliance guys. Because, the test drive, as you said, look at it. There was always a huge demand and from the community that we enable this. And this is what, let me say, we're still on the journey. We have the POCs, we have then the test drive and so on. But it's definitely, what I see, it's an enabler. AI is an enabling that you can really bring the security topic in. You always have to keep it like a sandwich. It's like you have to wrap it around. If you only think about only AI, it's too narrow. AI is like a Swiss knife, but you have to use it. It's a multi-purpose tool. So how you orchestrate this, how you do this in the company, I think this is the key for success. So especially you mentioned, I have to point back to the regulation, especially in Europe. It's a little bit difficult then to make this really on a full rollout. This is where we are at the moment with the different regulators to think about that we're using AI for getting more secure code. Another thing is like if you're using AI to really for business purposes. So I think for banks, it's like if you decide about if someone getting a loan or not, if this is decided by an AI engine and so on, it's a different beast. That's from a regulatory perspective. But really AI helps assist you to make code better, and even with this new features like auto remediation and everything, I think this is a key for success.
And Jarrett, in your organization, I'm sure there's more, again, demand for AI, but who else needs to be at the table to say yes to that? And how do you get them over the hump on this is a good thing, we can use it, here's the right way to put the guardrails around it so that it can help drive the organization forward?
Yeah, so I think, so as we've embarked on the journey with bringing Gen AI into the developer ecosystem, the first groups we actually involved. So a colleague of mine in our cybersecurity, he runs kind of operational side. We brought in our enterprise technology risk and audit group, and we brought in our lawyers. So that was the team, right? Me and a bunch of other people I normally stay well away from.
It takes a village, right?
It takes a village, but the thing is, it was about education. So what is it? How does it work? And I think bringing them through to build their confidence, build their understanding and build their knowledge about what this is, what it isn't, and how it operates, and because all they're most interested in is, from Fidelity perspective, is our data safe, is our IP safe, is it safe? And you just work through that and you bring them along. And so before we even allow developers even next to near it. So we've done that, and we've been hugely successful in that. And I wouldn't say we're quite over the line yet, but I'd say we're nearly 90% there now as part of that one. But I do think the AI is both a blessing and a curse, because it accelerates our development in all our organizations, but it also accelerates the ability for threat actors or bad actors to create things. And they, a colleague of mine in our cyber group says, a threat actor only has to be lucky once.
Yeah.
We have to be 100% right all the time.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it's how do we use it? How do we use it to defend? But also, the one bit of feedback I'd have is when there's usually a threat, it's new, right? And these models don't necessarily have the information because they were trained prior to the threat being created. So I think as an industry, I think we still figure out how do we use it successfully in guarding against threats and scanning, advanced security, the co-pilot with advanced security, providing the fixes for vulnerabilities and actually accelerating their development, keeping that source secure. But then also when new things come in, how does that operationally work and the logistics of that? But I think it's part of our lives, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
So we have to figure out how to embrace it and don't be afraid of it, and use it to drive our businesses forward.
Yeah, certainly. I think there's no going back from it at this point. No. So figuring out how we'll drive it forward in a way that's safe and secure and responsible is a great way to think about it. Well, as we move to the last question, I'll start with Vince on this. Hopefully we'll all be back here again next year, and the five of us can talk about this at one of the parties in the evening about, hey, look how much has changed in the last year. If you look into the crystal ball and you think about the conversations we're going to be having about security and AI next year, maybe just a few words as we bring it to a close from each of you on kind of what you're excited about or what your prediction is over the course of the next year. And Vince, we can start with you.
So for me, AI is following the Gartner hype model. You have the peak of inflated expectations, and then followed by the trough of disillusionment. And I think we've gone past that now, and we're on the slope of enlightenment. And I think we are going to start seeing, especially in the cybersecurity sphere, the use of AI, because as we've discussed, we're not the only ones using it. Yep. Time to exploit is coming down quicker and quicker. You can send out phishing emails that are looking more, authentic. The bad guys are using AI, so we need to understand and use AI to defend.
It will continue to be a cat and mouse game.
Completely, but we have to enable, on Helen's point, we have to enable our developers. The developer in me wants to use all the new sexy tools, but the cybersecurity guy goes, no, let's calm down, everyone just take a breath and let's understand it. So we have to build this walled garden where innovation can happen, but in a safe, controlled
area. And Jer, how about you? Your prediction for next year?
I'm just so excited to the opportunities it's going to create for us all. I think we'll only be limited by our imaginations, and I do think if we embrace it, I just look forward to what the world's going to create, the ideas that people are going to come up with, and the ability for using AI to translate those ideas into products and services that we'll all use across our lives. And I saw the video earlier on of the girl, how they're using co-pilot to be part of the world and making it more inclusive for everybody. So I think if we embrace it, I think we can have a fantastic world and
good problems to solve.
Great problems to solve.
Indeed. Yeah. Thanks for that, Siggy.
Yeah, so I think there will be some, why did we do this before, not before, like, it's like, oh, wow, it's happening so long. And as Vince, as you said, it's like, with new power there comes, new countermeasures, what you have then to think about. It's really like in next year, I think we will more talk about, getting the next level of security in both ways, being more preemptive, being predictive, and so on. Yeah, it's like this is something that I will foresee then for next year.
Exciting. And Helen will give you the last word on this topic.
Sure. For me is to leverage AI, automation, and all the features that I've seen the last 2 days to help our engineers shift their features from first commit to production in minutes. If I can do that, I'll come back next year to brag about it and get on the stage saying that we have achieved this. It's commit to production in minutes. So that's sort of my North Star I'm trying to chase after what I've seen the last 2 days.
Outstanding. Well, we're at time, so I'll ask the audience, please join me in thanking our excellent panelists for your insights. So thank you all so much. And I hope everybody enjoys the rest of a great universe. So thank you. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.